And welcome once more to Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr, joined as always by Juan Zarate, our national security analyst. Juan, good to see you.
Bob, good to see you.
Front and center, Ukraine. Yeah. This is a crisis that seems to be getting worse by the minute.
Yeah, the very question of whether or not the conflict would grow, whether or not there could be secession or even civil war is actually looking more and more possible. You have tension now growing with the occupation of government offices in the Crimea by militias that support Russia, flying the Russian flag over Ukrainian territory. You have the Russians having an impromptu military exercise. You have the Ukrainians warning the Russians, especially the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, not to move beyond restricted areas. And if they do that and they are armed, it will be viewed as an invasion. And so tensions rising, and we find out that Yanukovych is appearing in Moscow, not unexpected, and is making statements under the protective gaze of Vladimir Putin.
So President Yanukovych is in Moscow. That's now been revealed. He's going to have a news conference of some kind on Friday. How can he do that and maintain still that he is the elected leader of Ukraine?
Well, I don't know. I think he can try to make an argument that he's there for consultations. He's meeting with an ally, the Russians, is there for his own safety. He's clearly made the argument that and the Russians have echoed this, that the steps taken in Kiev have been illegitimate, unconstitutional. They've unseated democratically elected presidents. So those are all the arguments you'll hear. The problem is he's lost all legitimacy, both with how he tried to suppress the protesters, with the violence he did, with his sort of profligate use of assets. We've now seen the pictures of his home and his credibility, and the fact that he's now fled the country.
And he faces charges on mass murder.
And he faces charges, and the Ukrainians have asked the International Criminal Court to take this up.
Let me ask you where this might go. And I know nobody has a crystal ball here, but with the Russians doing military exercises near the border, that's very provocative. Secretary of State Kerry said, be careful here. He warned the Russians very pointedly. Could this spin out of control, and could a mistake trigger a problem?
Well, I think so, in part because it doesn't appear like the landscape is completely controlled by either side. And so this takeover of the government offices in Crimea came from a militia unit. I don't know if the Russians asked them to do it, Yanukovych did, but you have actors in the space that could trigger, could be a flashpoint to a conflict. And we've seen this over and over in history where there's tension, where there's miscalculation, where there's actors that may not be fully under control, could trigger something that's violent. I think the problem here, too, is you've got the example of 2008 with Russia and Georgia, and the Georgians are aware of this. The Georgians came to Washington for consultations. They're worried because they've seen this movie before, and the Russians moved in to help with the secession of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, used their peacekeepers that were there over 20 years. And so the Ukrainians see the 2008 example as a potential example of what may come in Crimea. And the Russians have the advantage of not only having a Russian sort of base population that's sympathetic to them, but also the Black Sea Fleet that's based in Sevastopol. So they don't need to march troops in. Their troops are already there.
And just real quick, 30 seconds, what does the U.S. do right now, next several days?
Well, I think you see the warning shots. I think working very closely with allies. You've seen meetings between the Ukrainians and NATO to reassure Ukraine that there is support in the NATO alliance in terms of their territorial sovereignty. I also think people need to go back to the Budapest Agreement. Remember, in 1994, the Ukrainians gave up their nuclear weapons. The Russians, British, Americans guaranteed Ukraine's territorial sovereignty for that deal. And so the Russians need to be reminded of that. The world needs to be reminded of that. Ukraine isn't going to be split up. We're not going to allow it to happen. The question is, does anyone listen to what we have to say anymore, given that red lines aren't really honored or consequences don't follow? Very
tense situation, and one we have to keep an eye on. Juan, thanks as always.
Thank you, Bob.
And thanks to you for watching Flashpoints. I'm Bob Orr. We'll see you next time.